Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric series, The Port Authority, where I look at some of my favorite arcade games of all time and weigh them directly against their home console counterparts. And today we have the massive disappointment, which is Daytona USA ported to Sega Saturn. When I say this port absolutely ruined all of Saturn's momentum and just got absolutely torn down in reviews, I 100% mean it, because when we got this port at home, sure, it was Daytona USA, all the levels and cars were there, but it did not live up to the promise of Sega producing a 3D console. And I know that they got a better version of Daytona on the console later on, but we're here to talk about the historical impact of just how bad of a look this was for Sega and their brand new Sega Saturn hardware, because people were expecting the future, and what they ended up getting at launch was a poor facsimile of what Daytona USA was. And to say Daytona USA is a classic game would be an understatement. I have talked about this series maybe more so than any other on my channel, and that's just because I grew up with Daytona USA in the arcades. When I got a Sega Saturn, I was so excited to get this game and play it at home, and even my kid brain, who was just excited for new video games, knew full well that what I was playing was not what I remembered in the arcades, because Model 2 absolutely was an incredible platform for visuals. And while today we know that it would be impossible to bring Model 2 home at any sort of cost-effective price, we just didn't expect to see what the Sega Saturn had to offer, because this version of the game on Model 2 is fast, it controls well, the visuals are excellent. It really was the pinnacle of what 3D could look like back in the day, because Sega was 100% leading the charge. We go from something like this to something like this, and you're left wondering what in the hell happened. And this was a port made by Sega, and this was basically one of the first games that was previewed in magazines, and it basically started the entire concept of Sega Saturn can't do 3D, Sega Saturn can't keep up with PlayStation 1 when it comes to 3D, and Sega Saturn is difficult to program for. Now, of course, it is a difficult platform to program for, we know that still today, but as the Saturn library went on, we found games that could go toe-to-toe with the PlayStation 1 in regards to 3D. But this being the first impression that the hardware made at home with what was Sega's biggest hit to date in arcades was just absolutely a disaster for Sega. People wanted to know, after the Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo wars, that Sega could go toe-to-toe with Sony and offer you something amazing, as obviously Nintendo 64 was not out at this point in time. It was just kind of a concept that was coming in the future. But when people turned on their Sega Saturns and were met with this, it just did not hit in any way, shape, or form. The frame rate is absolutely abysmal, and the draw distance, you feel like you're just driving into nothing until the screen actually pops up with something, versus seeing the Model 2 again, you can see the night and day difference. Now, of course, with hindsight, we know that the Sega Saturn was never going to be able to pull off Model 2 visuals. It just was not as powerful, because to put a system that would compare to Model 2 in the homes would probably be a couple $1,000s for that console, and Sega was not getting into Neo Geo territory. Unfortunately, this is the territory they started out with, and it just doesn't look very good whatsoever. The pop-in is massive, everything is wiggling and juddering around the screen, but the worst part is the frame rate just makes the game not very fun to play, and that is what Daytona USA really hit on in the arcades. It was quick pick up and play arcade racing action. You got in, you had a ton of fun, and you got out. And even if I did get a first place finish here, it's just one of those things. This game still today lets me down, because we know exactly how good the Sega Saturn could do on the 3D side of things later on down the line, because when we got a port of Sega Rally, sure, it never kept up with the Model 2, but it 100% proved that the Sega Saturn could have very good ports from Model 2 to the Saturn in and of itself, and really do amazing 3D when in the right hands. But of course, this was basically one of the games that came first, so it always loses to that experience of years later. Now, moving on to the second course in the game, and it's going to be the exact same story, and this one's even worse, because some of the twists and turns in the road absolutely confuse you as to which direction you're even supposed to go in the Saturn version, in my opinion, and I will call them out when we get to them. But as far as the visuals here, those blue skies that they even sing about, all of the colors, this just screams Sega in the arcades. And again, the frame rate is really what you need here. You want that responsiveness, and it's not like they had to go to like 30 frames per second on Saturn. In some instances, it feels like it's running in like the 14 to 16 frame per second range. But here's your soundtrack sample as well. First Model 2, then Saturn. Listen, and I'll be right back with more. Well, there is one direction that I can say the Saturn does seem to win in, and that's the audio quality with the Red Book does sound better and clearer on the Sega Saturn versus the actual Model 2 original, but that is literally the only place in which the Daytona USA port on Saturn is going to take the checkered flag. And right here, this turn, the amount of polygons just breaking up, the amount of distortion and wiggling around, it becomes difficult in my opinion to really see the optimal racing line, and you even have all of those polygons, or technically quads, kind of warping as they roll off the screen behind the car, which makes it look like you're almost on a treadmill and you're watching the end of the belt go back underneath before it comes back around. And even though a side-by-side is going to be even worse, we are going to do it, and you can just see the motion cadence difference here. The Sega Saturn version feels like it's just absolutely doing everything it can to not completely stop working. It feels like it's held together with gaff tape, spit, and just a couple prayers and dreams, where the Model 2 version is smooth running, it looks great, it sounds great, it plays great, and it has the frame rate to match. And that really is what killed the Sega Saturn's momentum in my opinion, because people knew that Sony was coming out with a new console and the hype was behind them, but Sega had a really good competition with the Super Nintendo in North America and in Japan with the PC Engine as well, and people were excited to see the next Sega console. And of course the whole story is that they were developing it just for 2D and added 3D late, and that's totally fine and may be the case, but we know they could do better than this, and I totally understand they didn't really have a fully fleshed out software development kit. The hardware is brand new, there were always going to be some growing pains, but to release this as the best effort they had to start just doesn't work for Sega, and it really did make them look terrible in comparison to PlayStation 1. And the problem is that perception continued the entirety of both consoles' lifespans. The Sega Saturn was always considered to be inferior to the PlayStation 1, not just in the game library, because I do think Saturn has some absolute hits, but in just the overall performance. But we know, looking at games now today, that the Sega Saturn could do effective 3D, and of course every single console gets better games as time goes on and developers get comfortable with the hardware, the software development kit gets updated and matured, and better documentation comes out. But it didn't matter how good of 3D games Saturn would have in the future, stuff like Daytona USA would always basically taint its overall reputation. And again, I think it is warranted, and don't think I don't love the Sega Saturn. It is my favorite console of that console generation. I put it above the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 as far as the fun factor for me is concerned. I had one back in the day, and I still have a very big Sega Saturn collection. There's also a PlayStation 1 collection, so I love them both honestly, but I'm not trying to crap on Sega Saturn here, but they just kind of deserve the shit I'm giving them, because this was not what we needed to see as fans. Playing the game in the arcades was incredible, and even if we didn't think we'd get exactly that, we should have gotten a lot better than what we got on the Sega Saturn, because this right here looks absolutely incredible, and the best part is it is 100% fluid and fast and fun to play. But you go to something like this on the Model 2, to this on the Sega Saturn, and it just looks like absolute dog shit in comparison. It's the only way to put it, and it's just down to the frame rate being absolutely too slow to actually be able to play the game in any fun way. I get it, there's going to be pop-in and draw distance, there's nothing to stop that, but if there was this amount of pop-in but the game was running at 30 frames per second consistently, I think we could forgive it a little bit more. But when you're actually trying to take a turn and you don't even see the end of the turn or the wall until you're basically on top of it, it just puts it into a situation where it makes the game hard to play. And that is not what you want for any video game, especially a port of one of your most famous and successful arcade games of all time. You don't want people to sit down and struggle to actually find the fun in it, and even to this day, I have more than one copy of Daytona USA on my shelf, but I just have them there to have them in my collection. If I'm going to play the game, I'm going to play the Model 2 version of the game or any of the other re-releases that modernize the Daytona USA formula, because this is what I remember from arcades. This is what I've loved in arcades, and this in my kid brain is kind of what I expected to get. Now, of course, with a lot of decades since this actually happened, I understand that the Sega Saturn was never going to be able to look like Model 2, but it didn't have to look like Sega Saturn as bad as it was when we actually got Daytona USA at home. There is no redeeming quality of that port. Sure, it did prove that the Sega Saturn did have 3D on it, it just didn't have 3D at a good frame rate, it didn't have 3D that looked good, and it didn't have 3D that didn't have severe pop-in. When you compared something like the port of Daytona USA to Ridge Racer on the PlayStation 1, the narrative got written basically the first 6 months of the console's lifespan. Sega Saturn couldn't do 3D anywhere near as well as the PlayStation 1. So as far as this port authority is concerned, there is a clear winner. It took the Saturn version out back and shot it. Bye-bye.